Raquel.
Thanks, Dish. You did, in fact, give us some great questions to think about, but I only ran with one of those, which is broadly how Judith has influenced my own way of working. So to start out with, there's absolutely no way I could do justice to how Judith has shaped my thinking and my way of working. So what I'll try to do is just share a story that perhaps will give you a sense, slight sense, of how she influences me on a day-to-day. First, a bit of context. So I'm at Oxfam, advocacy and humanitarian agency. We aim high, and I'm part of a team that's trying to reform how U.S. provides foreign aid. We're starting from a very low base. AID is not what it used to be back early then. So in some ways, since we're starting at such a low base, it makes our job a little easier, but it's still quite ambitious. What is it I do as a researcher? We're not a think tank, we're an advocacy agency. My mandate is to help guide and substantiate our advocacy. So I do secondary research, I do field research over the last 3 years. For instance, I manage research involving 15 different field visits, extensive 1 week or 2 weeks on the ground, where we try to see what does this mean on the ground? What does the debate in Washington about how the U.S. provides foreign aid and the tensions between State Department and AID and what missions need to do and problems with headquarters, what does that mean by people on the ground? And initially that meant it meant government officials and civil society. But I knew going in that there was a huge other bucket that we had to talk with, and that's our frontline aid workers. So that's what I do. So a bit of context and on to the story. It is a historic moment for AID, for foreign aid. AID has been marginalized, pushed back, cut back, all those. As an organization, it no longer has so many of the capacities that it once had. Lower budgets, lower staff. Where once it had actual technical expertise, now it has contract program officers. Where once it had a really great portfolio, where it had a lot of infrastructure and had some ag, now it's health. It's a lot of HIV/AIDS, some governance, huge portfolio with so many other things. Generally always contracted out to big contractors or U.S. agencies, U.S. NGOs. But now we are hopeful, and why is that? In some ways, since the Obama administration came in, we have gotten more momentum, more movement in reforming the system in the right ways, in ways that we didn't really quite expect. So you have AID re-energized, new staff, new mandates, new resources for the time being. We have the agency proposing new ways of working, where they're aiming to be more country-led, more demand-driven than not. Trying to engage more with the recipient governments and local organizations. They're aiming to improve their collaboration with other donors. They get lambasted everywhere they are for kind of being a cowboy and going on their own. And they're actually aiming to measure the results that matter. This is huge. AID is not bringing in people like Judith. They haven't been doing that for a long time. Not even as outsiders to come in and tell them and push them in the right direction. They're hoping now to change that. So in addition to all these reforms going on at AID, we also have the Obama administration trying to elevate development as part of our national security strategy along diplomacy and defense. And before midterm elections, we actually had draft preambles to a new Foreign Assistance Act, which may sound meaningless, but it's actually pretty big because we're still governed by the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act. So we at Oxfam have been giddy, extremely so with what we've seen so far. Of course, after midterm elections, environment has once again changed, and this window that we've been so excited about is starting to close a bit. But there's still some space there, and what we see at Oxfam, our role right now is to try to keep the spaces open as much as possible for AID, because if it can do half of what it's aiming to do right now, we have no doubt that foreign aid from the US will be a slightly better tool for development. Okay, the story. So in this context, the Obama administration rolls out a whole new initiative. Not always a good thing to do, but we have in the US, as other donors have, completely marginalized agriculture for a long time. So with the food crisis, donors realized that, oh, agriculture is an important one for us to focus on. So now again, the US is investing in agriculture. And they're doing it through an initiative called Feed the Future. Not a great name. In Guatemala, and I'm going to Guatemala, and I know there's some Guatemalans here. In Guatemala, Feed the Future is proposing to focus the support on 2 value chains, horticulture and gourmet coffee. So here we are in DC rallying for AID to have some space, to allow it to do what it's going to do. And yet Oxfam colleagues on the ground in Guatemala are saying, whoa, what is this Feed the Future? What are they saying they're going to do? They're saying that they're going to work better with our governments, but they're not quite doing that. Oh, and you know what? They're not consultative enough. And how are these value chains actually going to get to small farmers? So all of a sudden we have our colleagues on the ground who are ready to do the action, alert, and get things going, raising the flags that Feed the Future is really not what it's supposed to be on the ground. So I decide to go to Guatemala, where I had the privilege of spending about a week. Not long enough at all, but more so than just a couple of days. And there, of course, I had the privilege of interviewing your usual cast of characters. Minister of Agriculture, Secretaries of Agriculture, Secretaries of Planning, farmer groups, major ag export association, our U.S. frontline aid workers, and some implementers, some NGOs. Oxfam, by the way, does not receive $1 from U.S. government funding, so it gives us a little more voice on the debate. And there in Guatemala, as always, was Judith. In the better questions that I asked, in the stories that I saw emerging, and the implications I drew from my time there to help guide Oxfam's continued advocacy as we try to nudge Oxfam to nudge AID in the right direction. How so? And I'll focus on 3 ways. And I'm sorry, at this point of the day, you've all heard this common trend of how Judith has influenced us. So 3 ways. By the way she's pushed me to think historically, by focusing on the organization, and of course by drawing out the functional within the dysfunctional. First, historically, Feed the Future is a new initiative. AID in Guatemala is not. So the importance of looking back 5, 10, 15 years to understand, okay, AID, how have you been working in Guatemala? What has been your relationship with this very difficult government over the years? Oh my goodness, and let's think back to what the US was doing in Guatemala 50 years ago. This growers organization, how did you come about? Oh, AID has been supporting it for 28 years. That says something. And IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development, small farmers. So I was with my Oxfam colleagues, Oxfam Spain colleagues, and they're saying, oh my goodness, but IFAD is more like us, but AID is working with them, being the Export Growers Association. Oh my goodness, and they're talking to Walmart. So it sounds like these way strange bedfellows. How do we reconcile these? Second, by focusing on the organization. Lant alluded to Judith's Inside Foreign Aid. So that's before Good Government in the Tropics, before the Devil's Deal, that goes back. And in that piece, Judith does beautiful effort, as Lant described, in describing the workings of AID. And though the agency has no doubt changed over the years in ways I've mentioned, the insights, of course, raised back then are just as relevant today. And I'll focus on one. The point that Judith makes so eloquently there is elsewhere, that organizational factors often explain outcomes that tend to be considered the result of other things. So AID, all the problems for AID, oh, it's Congress. Congress says, AID, I want to see development results in a budget cycle, 12 months. Oh, AID, by the way, because I want to see those results, you need to tell me what you're doing, so you're going to be counting beans. How many farmers, number of trainings, number of ARVs, number of saved patients, number of bed nets distributed, which gets in the way of more longer-term thinking and us really thinking of outcomes as opposed to just these little outputs along the way. Ignoring what happened over time, I'm sorry. So no doubt AID is under congressional pressures, but when you look at how they're working, you find the missions doing things that you perhaps are quite surprised by. So back to Guatemala. A major mandate for Feed the Future is that it work more closely, that it be more country-driven. So instead of AID deciding in Washington, this is what we ought to do for Guatemala, it's this revolutionary idea that AID needs to be working very closely with the government of Guatemala, with those elements in the government that do have the plans, that do have the visions, that do have the strategies, as well as with citizen groups and civil society and academics and people in Guatemala. So not surprisingly, I arrive, and everybody's saying, oh, they're not consulting enough, they're doing the same as always. But of course, how can they change just like that? Feed the Future's just been rolling out for the last 6 months. So that in itself wasn't surprising. What was surprising is that when you think of this whole concept of country-led, as I mentioned, it's not just about working with governments in a different way. It's about working with local organizations in a different way. And here you have a mission that's been working with a very important local organization for this sector for over 28 years. So when you look at the trajectory of this Growers Association, it's an agriculture export and association, so mostly think fresh fruits, veggies, not your traditional sugarcane. This is a whole new class of entrepreneurs emerging in Guatemala. And the whole sector of agriculture exports has been incredibly dynamic in Guatemala. And with work of IFAD and others over time, you do see the smaller farmers coming in. And third, of course, about other ways Judith influences shaped my days in Guatemala, is the drawing out the functional within the dysfunctional. So here you have an example where AID comes across as a really long-term partner with a growers association I just mentioned, resourcefully partnering with IFAD. So where you have AID now proposing to expand these value chains are precisely areas where IFAD has been working for decades in helping these small farmers make the transition, organize, access credit, access land. And now AID can come in and really take them that next step. So you have here AID strategically supporting and skilling up a model that can actually work with farmers large and small. And these are things the mission has been doing even within the very dysfunctional environment we've been trying to reform in Washington. And it raises a bunch of questions that I need to think about. So what is it about this particular effort that explains how it's managed to do so much despite the constraints within the aid system? What can we learn from this particular effort as AID aims to improve its projects and efforts elsewhere? So I'm hoping to be busy over the next few months doing that. And it's important because even if we don't get any legislative reform right now with the Congress, even if we get budget cuts, there are still changes within AID that are possible. And in part because the agency has, if we look closely and stop, already operating in ways that would take the agency on a larger scale in the right direction. So just to wrap up, as I said, this is just a snapshot, no way to do justice. But if I walked away from Guatemala, my very few days in Guatemala, with a better understanding of how the US foreign aid can be a better tool for development, it was in no small part because of Judith's thinking, our time in the classroom, our days in Mossorol, our days in Sussex. We had this amazing walk on Brighton Beach one day. It was a long, long walk. And of course, the countless and precious feedback she gave to me throughout my entire journey. Thank you.